Thank you for joining us for this short webinar on one of the European Commission's latest proposals, which is the Clean Corporate Vehicles Regulation. This marks an important step in the EU's transition towards decarbonisation and sustainable mobility, as we will be discussing for the first time, really, binding member state targets on the uptake of zero and low emission vehicles. I'm also happy to welcome here Mr. Dario Dubolino from the European Commission. He's actually team leader for sustainable transport in the Sustainable and Innovative Transport Unit at the European Commission's Directorate General for Mobility and Transport. So he works on the Clean Vehicles Directive, the Clean Corporate Vehicles proposal, and more generally on transport decarbonisation and also alternative fuels.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. And indeed, let me see if I can share my screen and show the presentation. Here. You should see it in full screen now, I think.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so let's dive straight into it. Context of this proposal and why we presented it. We have at the moment, when we look at road transport decarbonization, our main measures that we have already in place are on the vehicle supply side. So the CO2 emission performance standards for both light and heavy duty vehicles that are now under revision, the LDVs ones. These set targets for the manufacturers on their emission reduction, which will be achieved in large part by increasing the share of zero emission vehicles. We do have one measure only on the vehicle demand side, that's the Clean Vehicles Directive. This focuses only on public procurement and it covers LDVs, trucks and buses. And we have measures that create the right enabling condition for zero emission vehicles, specifically the alternative fuel infrastructure regulation that ensures that there are sufficiently recharging and refueling points for the vehicles, the zero emission vehicles that are coming to the market, Eurovignette and ETS2 that will make those vehicles more competitive. In the Automotive Action Plan, a bit more than a year ago, we announced that we would publish a proposal on corporate fleets, but we also had a communication titled Decarbonized Corporate Fleets, where we highlighted a set of measures that can already be taken at a national, regional, local level to promote a higher share of zero emission vehicles in corporate fleets. When we look at the market and why are we looking at corporate vehicles? So every year in Europe, we register approximately 10-11 million new cars, 1.5 million vans, 300,000 lorries and 30,000 buses and coaches. More or less, these figures tend to be rather stable year after year. When we look at cars, 60% of the new registrations are corporate vehicles, 58% to be precise last year. Vans, this is even higher, and when it comes to lorries and buses and coaches, corporate are basically the whole market. No one really registers a truck or a bus in his or her own name as a private person. The one thing that I should note here, this is new registration, not the vehicles on the road. Because corporate vehicles are renewed more quickly, they are overrepresented in new registration compared to the number of vehicles that we see effectively on the road over the longer term. So corporate vehicles are a very large share of new registrations every year. And this is one first element. The other element is that bringing a higher level of zero emission vehicles in corporate vehicles will bring higher benefits than if they are registered by private individuals. Why? The first reason is higher real-world emission reductions. In general, corporate vehicles have a much higher mileage than private ones. It depends on the type of vehicle, but in general, for example, if you take a taxi, the yearly mileage is usually about 10 times higher than a private car. Which makes sense because this is a vehicle that is used for commercial purposes. If you've invested into a vehicle, you want to use it as much as possible, that as part of your business. What this means, however, is that if you replace an internal combustion engine taxi with a zero emission vehicle, you're saving in the first year 10 times more emissions than if you were replacing a private car. The other aspect is the turnover to the second-hand market. Corporate vehicles are usually resold much faster than private vehicles. If you look at rental cars, a rental company typically keeps a car around 11 months on average, less than a year anyway, and then they resell it. So if you replace an internal combustion, so if a new zero-emission vehicle is bought by a private person, it will typically reach the second-hand market 5, 6, 7, 10 years after the purchase. If it's a rental car, it's 11 months. Leasing a car, typically 3 years or so. And 80% of EU citizens buy their vehicle second-hand, not new. So at the moment, we have a problem of affordability of zero-emission vehicles because they can save money in the longer term, but initial purchase costs are still higher than conventional ones in general. And 80% of citizens buy second-hand anyway. So making sure that we have a faster increase in the share of zero-emission vehicles available on the second-hand market will ensure affordability of zero-emission solutions. So these are the reasons why we have presented a proposal. Before I go into the proposal itself, if you will bear with me for another minute, I'll give an overview of the types of corporate vehicles that we have on the market, because I think what we saw before we presented the proposal, a lot of the discussions treated corporate vehicles as if they were one single block. There are actually significant differences between types of corporate vehicles. A big share of the market is represented by leasing vehicles. These are the vehicles that are registered by a company that then makes them available to citizens or other companies as a leasing. They are typically reaching the second-hand market relatively quickly, 3 to 5 years. Their mileage depends a lot on who is the final client and what kind of use they want to have. This is a rather concentrated market with few large actors dominating the overall market. And importantly, there are overlaps with other fleet types. For example, many taxis are leased or many company cars are leased. Rental, these are the vehicles rented by a rental company to citizens, mostly for touristic purposes and to businesses. They have the fastest turnover to the second-hand market, less than a year, as I mentioned already. They have usually a high mileage. This is another concentrated market. And importantly, this is also not just concentrated in the sense that you have a few large companies dominating the market, but also it has some specificities. For example, it's largely dependent on airport infrastructure. A lot of tourist rental happens at airports with the corresponding issues with availability of charging points, but also seasonality. Company cars, the vehicles that are provided by an employer to the employee as a type of benefit in kind for use also for private use as well. This also has a fast turnover to the second-hand market. Importantly, the reason why people use or are given company cars are fiscal. So this is a section of the market that is particularly sensitive to the fiscal treatment of the vehicle. Self-registration by manufacturers. So for example, the showroom and the test vehicles, and etc. So vehicles that are registered by the manufacturer themselves, typically very low mileage, and they are quickly resold. And finally, through lease, which is a bit of an umbrella term covering everything else. In general, the vehicles used by companies for their commercial activity. A company car is something that the employee uses for their own private use as well. Here we're talking about the vehicles used for commercial activity. They generally have very high mileage. The turnover is quite variable, and it's a very broad category. You have taxis, ride-hailing companies like Uber or Bolt, car sharing, but also all the service cars and vans that are used by companies to bring stuff and equipment where they need to provide services. Engineering companies, the plumber coming to your house to repair the sink with a company van, the electricians, lawyers, professionals using their car for work. And finally, logistic fleets. If you want, this is a subcategory of service cars and van, but it's worth identifying specifically the ones that are used to distribute goods. So haulers, e-commerce, postal and delivery services, and etc. Now, This is important to understand the impacts of the proposal, but in the proposal we treat all corporate vehicles as one, effectively. You don't have specific rules by type of corporate vehicle. Here you can see the shares. So you see in cars, leasing and long-term rental represent 42% of new registration. The other categories are rather equally distributed, and true fleet is really small. That's because a lot of the true fleets cars are registered as a leasing vehicle. For vans, this is significantly different. You can see that half the vans are registered as true fleets, and leasing still represent the other 30%, and the other categories are rather small. So the proposal. We are looking at cars and vans registered by larger undertaking. We are setting national targets for the member states, not for individual companies, to ensure a minimum share of zero and low emission vehicles in new registration by large companies. And we put rules on what kind of financial support member state can provide to corporate vehicles. Going in more detail, so in terms of the scope, we look at corporate vehicle, meaning vehicle registered by a legal person, not by a physical person. We are only looking at light duty vehicles, cars and vans, so we are not including trucks and buses and coaches. And when we say vehicles registered by large undertakings, what this means is that only vehicles that are registered by an undertaking that has at least 250 employees and at least 50 million euros turnover. Vehicles that are registered by an SME or by private individuals are not in the scope of the proposal. And we are only looking at new vehicle registration, the first registration in the union. So a second-hand vehicle being registered as a second-hand is not in the scope. The targets, this is the core of the proposal. So we are setting targets for the member states. We are not setting targets for individual companies. So there is nothing in the proposal that will result in company X having to have 20% or 30% or 50% zero emission vehicle. The member states have to ensure that out of all the corporate vehicles registered in their territory in a given year by large undertakings, at least a certain percentage are zero and low emission vehicles, and a lower percentage of that are zero emission vehicles. So the idea, the approach that we follow with this proposal is we set the targets on the member states, and the member states will have to create the right conditions for undertakings to choose a zero emission or zero low emission vehicle when they register their new vehicle. So we're not setting mandatory targets on individual companies. The targets are calculated starting from an EU level ambition that you see here in the slide. In 2030, for cars, it's at least 69% zero and low emission and 45% zero emission. And for vans, that's 40 and 36. And then 2035, we go for both cars and vans, 95% zero and low emission and 80% zero emission, capped at 95%. So this is the level of ambition at EU level, and then we modulate these for the national targets on the basis of the GDP per capita. So member states that have whose GDP per capita is 1.3 times the EU average or more, they get a target, each of the target here multiplied by 1.3. Between 1.1 and 1.3, they get 1.2 times the target, etc., as presented in the slide here. This is to reflect the fact that the economic reality in member states is different, and the affordability of the initial purchase price of zero emission vehicle would be different in each member state. Here you see how this is translated into the individual targets by member state in the proposal. You can see that Malta is at here 69.45 for cars in 2035, and then 95.80 and 40.30. So it's exactly at the average. Finally, an important element is financial support. Article 4 in the proposal requires member states to, as of 1st of January 2028, to stop providing financial support to corporate cars and vans that are not zero and low emission vehicles and made in the EU. Here the proposal, the presentation presents what is in the proposal, which is in Article 5, we have delegated acts for the Commission to set up a methodology to determine what it means that a caravan is made in the EU. We have, in the meantime, presented a proposal for Industrial Accelerator Act, and we expect the co-legislators to effectively replace these delegated acts with a direct reference to the criteria in the Industrial Accelerator Act. We could not do that directly when we adopted the proposal because we cannot cross-reference an act that has not been presented yet as a proposal. So that is a quick overview of the proposal. I expect there will be questions and comments. Thank you.